All right, so here we are doing another virtual online lecture from my College Credit Plus class. This is College Credit Plus U.S. History 2, and this lecture comes from the American YAWP textbook. Right now we're in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic as I'm filming this, so I'm forced to come up with some sort of alternative measures to provide instruction. And if you hear grunting, crying, it's my daughter. She's literally right here. She's a little baby. I'll show her to you real quick. She's just gonna hang out right next to me while I teach, and then my other son's upstairs, so he might interrupt, but we'll make do with what we got, right? So I guess this is the second, I guess technically we're starting the third decade of the 2000s, so yeah, this is just 21st century education. So let's get started. The first thing I want to talk about is the title. It's called The Unraveling. I don't think that it means the unraveling of America as a whole, but maybe more of unraveling of old traditional ideals and traditional, I guess, culture and things that had happened in the past, and sort of leading to new, or rolling away sort of these layers to reveal sort of new, I guess, ideas for people and new opportunities for people in the United States. All right, so first issue when it comes to, there we go. So here are your key terms. I'll give you just a second to check those out. Jot them down. If you're in my class, you know that your quizzes all come almost directly from these key terms. So if you need to pause it to write them down, go ahead, and I'll give you just a second, but I'll be moving on, and again, you can pause to write them down. All right, so first, let's watch this video. This might be a good one for you to check out, and we'll get more into it here in just a second. Oops, so I immediately screw up the video. All right.
Hello and welcome to History Pod. On the 6th of December 1969, teenager Meredith Hunter was killed at the Altamont Speedway Free Festival during a performance by the Rolling Stones. Intended to be a West Coast version of the Woodstock Festival that had taken place earlier that year, the Altamont concert should have ended the 1960s and the year of Summer of Love on a high. The concert was organised jointly by Jefferson Airplane, the Grateful Dead and the Rolling Stones, but the venue was only finalised 2 days beforehand due to scheduling conflicts and financial disputes. As a result, the usual concert infrastructure was unable to be installed on time. This meant that both the stage and the venue as a whole were ill prepared for the 300,000 concertgoers who attended. Members of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club were given $500 of beer in return for providing informal security for the vulnerable stage. The exact details of the arrangement remain unclear, but as the day progressed, the mood of both the crowd and the Angels themselves began to deteriorate. Even the lead singer of Jefferson Airplane was knocked unconscious when he tried to stop fights breaking out, the Angels by then having armed themselves with sawn-off pool cues and motorcycle chains. Seeing the mounting violence, the Grateful Dead refused to play. The Rolling Stones began their set after dark. Having already been involved in a fight, 18-year-old attendee Meredith Hunter approached the stage during the song Under My Thumb and drew a gun. Alan Passero, one of the Hells Angels, disarmed him and delivered at least 2 stabs with a knife drawn from his belt. Hunter died at the festival, while his attacker was put on trial for murder. However, he was later acquitted on grounds of self-defense after footage of Hunter drawing the gun was identified in film taken on the day.
All right, so there is our little backstory, I guess, for for Meredith Hunter and the Altamont Speedway. Let's get out of full screen. Huh, this is interesting. Not letting me exit out of this. Let's see, we can escape. There we go. All right. So, we have I guess an attempt to have a Woodstock on the West Coast, okay? And the idea is that this would be a peace-going concert, free concert for everyone to go to, and it doesn't quite turn out that way. Altamont revealed the dark side of the 60s youth culture. Drugs, music, and youth were associated, and many Americans in the 70s continued to celebrate the political and cultural achievements of the previous decade. A more anxious, conservative mood grew across the nation. For some, the U.S. had gone a little too far, and others it had not gone far enough to I guess, make right equality for everyone. It seemed that the nation was ready to unravel. And so when we talk about Altamont, who would have thought that adding free beer, or paying them in beer, your security guards, would lead to success? Not really sure how that went down. I mean, sounds like they provided good security, but maybe not the most professional type of security. But the Hells Angels biker gang, I'm sure were fueled by more than just alcohol, probably some drugs involved there as well. But they were expected to provide security of a rowdy crowd who was also drunk and probably high and all that good stuff. And it was just a recipe for disaster. And so as the video showed, Meredith Hunter was killed, and the Hells Angels biker was basically let off because of self-defense. So we have some issues, Vietnam issues. Let's see if I can fix this real quick. There it is. All right. Get my notes. So, as the war deteriorated, the Johnson administration escalated American involvement by deploying hundreds of thousands of troops to prevent the communist takeover of the South. And again, this is the communist takeover of South Vietnam. Stalemate, body counts, hazy war aims, and the draft catalyzed the anti-war movement that you've probably all maybe seen or heard of, especially in like Forrest Gump, right? With no end in sight, protesters burnt draft cards, refused to pay income taxes, they occupied government buildings, they delayed trains that were loaded with war supplies and materials. And so by 1967, anti-war demonstrations were drawing hundreds of thousands of people. Vietnam was the first living room war, though. This is the first war where television and print media really played a major role in the public perception and the, I guess, morale behind the whole war. They had unprecedented coverage, and it showed the conflict's brutality. The CBS Evening News actually aired a segment in 1965 where the U.S. Marines had burnt the South Vietnamese village of Cam Nay with little apparent regard for the lives of occupants. And so, I don't know if this is the picture from that or not, but there's obviously, this is showing children running from the destruction, and it shows, and Americans saw this, and no matter what you thought about the Vietnamese in general, Vietnamese children suffering, innocent people suffering, that was questionable. So the U.S. government, they had no formal censorship of this war. Now in World War II, they would censor things that came back to the home front and such and such. But this one was not, there was no formal censorship. What they did do, however, was in their daily press briefings, they would just kind of paint a prettier picture of the war than what was truly going on. But the media actually, I guess, exposed the truth, or they went and covered the conflict and they exposed the truth. And so the afternoon press briefings in Saigon became known as the 5 o'clock follies, because they were pretty much a joke to the average American. Here's our first interruption. Let me see what my son needs. What up, dude? Cool. All right, I'm recording. Can you go upstairs again and watch your video? I don't know how people parented before YouTube. Just saying. So, the truth gap between the media and the actual White House actually widened. It got further and further. The Tet Offensive was sort of the major thing that showed how wide this gap was. 1968 was the year of the Tet Offensive, and essentially the Viet Cong just launched a bunch of attacks throughout the entire country, and it kind of showed that the forces fighting the Viet Cong were not doing as good as they said they were. If they could attack anywhere in the country whenever they wanted on such a wide scale, and so that kind of, I guess, painted a better picture for how the Americans were not winning this war, I guess you could say. In 1969, there were, or I guess before 1969, but there were a lot of news stories that eroded the public's trust in the actual conflict. And in 1969, an investigative reporter named Seymour Harsh revealed that U.S. troops had raped and or massacred hundreds of civilians in the village of My Lai. 3 years later, Americans cringed at Nick Ute's wrenching photograph of naked Vietnamese child fleeing an American napalm attack, which I believe this might be the photo. And these things changed the attitudes towards the war. So the Vietnam War, maybe if we're talking about the perception of it, it poisoned many Americans' perceptions of the government and its role in the world. While the anti-war demonstrations attracted considerable media attention and stand today as a hallmark of the 60s counterculture, many Americans still kind of thought the war was just. And wary of the rapid social changes that were going on in the country at the time, and the anti-war protests and the threatening of the civil order, it sort of led to this growing conservative movement in America at this time. All right, next slide. Now, during this, I guess, period, African Americans were becoming much more visible in American culture. Black cultural forms had been prominent throughout American history, but really popular forms in the 70s, such as like disco, emerges. And we have artists like Aretha Franklin, who brought her gospel background to the music scene and produced some really unique compilations or mixtures of music. And they would work often with artists like the Rolling Stones and collaborate with them. By the end of the decade, African American musical artists had introduced American society to one of the most significant musical innovations of the decades. Rap, basically. And what we have is the Sugar Hill Gang's Rapper's Delight. So, see the start of the rap movement, which is pretty popular. I mean, it's dying in popularity a little bit today, but it's still around today. Perhaps the strongest element fueling American anxiety over law and order was the increasingly visible violence associated with the civil rights movement. No longer confined to the anti-black terrorism that struck the Southern civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, publicly visible violence now broke out among black Americans in urban riots and among whites protesting new civil rights programs. Okay? So it's no longer just confined to the South and viewed as terrorizing the blacks in the South under maybe like Jim Crow. It's sort of spreading throughout the rest of the United States. let's see. Urban riots, though. Urban riots, rather than anti-integration violence, tainted many white Americans' perception of the civil rights movement in urban life. Civil unrest broke out across the country. We have riots in Watts County, Los Angeles. We have riots in Newark, Detroit. They were the most shocking. Each of them were a physical altercation between white police officers and African Americans, and they spiraled out of control. Tens of thousands participated in these, and they destroyed businesses, and specifically maybe white-owned businesses. Maybe that's why there was such a big racial tension on both sides. And what we have is dozens of deaths, tens of millions of dollars in property damage, and an exodus of white capital that only further isolated urban poverty. So basically the white capital refers to white money, white investment, even in the form of businesses and even in the form of people as well, leaving the city along with their money and their taxes and all those things and going out to the suburbs. And it's known as, white flight. And we have a draining of financial resources in these inner city communities. And as the whites leave, all we're left with are African Americans stuck in here with a increasingly large financial gap between the suburbs and the city. And it's creating, unfair circumstances. So we have President Johnson. Remember, he had kind of fought some of these poverties and civil rights stuff. He appointed the Kerner Commission to investigate the causes of America's riots. Their report became an unexpected bestseller. The commission cited black frustration with the hopelessness of poverty and the underlying cause of urban unrest as the underlying cause of urban unrest. So hopelessness of poverty was the underlying cause of urban unrest. And so Martin Luther King Jr. supposedly said that now I've got to do something to help them get the money to buy it. What good was the right to enter a store without money for purchases? So basically, why are we trying to get the right to go into stores and go eat at the same lunch counters and movie theaters and buses and all that stuff if my people, the African Americans, I guess, don't have the money to even enjoy those things? And so that's maybe the second part of the civil rights movement that Martin Luther King never really got to fully strive for. And so maybe 1968 could be the biggest year if we're talking about of maybe possibly of the 20th century, but for sure the second half of the 20th century, 1968. The greatest leader in the American civil rights movement was lost. He was assassinated. I think most people know that story. And we also have Robert F. Kennedy, who was what they call the last hope of liberal idealists, was assassinated as well. As the Vietnam War descended ever deeper into a brutal stalemate, and the Tet Offensive exposed the lies of the Johnson administration, students shut down college campuses and government facilities. Protests enveloped the nation. It's interesting. Apparently a pandemic can do that too, so that's crazy. And so Chicago's brutality overshadowed the convention, the Democratic National Convention, that is, at this time. The whole world is watching. This was at the Hilton Hotel in Chicago. The protesters chanted this. The whole world is watching. The Chicago riots encapsulated the growing sense that chaos now governed American life. For many 60s idealists, the violence of 1968 represented the death of a dream. Disorder and chaos overshadowed hope and progress. For conservatives, it was a confirmation of all their fears and hesitations. Americans of 1968 turned their back on hope. They just wanted peace. They wanted stability, and they wanted law and order. All right, we'll watch this video right quick, and we'll see what it's got to say.
For Democrats, the Chicago Convention of 1968 was a nightmare. Meeting after the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, Democrats fell into chaos, fighting Chicago police and each other.
With George McGovern as President of the United States, we wouldn't have to have Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago.
Mr. Daley is not pleased with Senator Ribicoff.
How hard it is to accept the truth.
Vice President Hubert Humphrey, hobbled by the unpopularity of President Johnson and his Vietnam War policies, appealed for order.
Surely we have now learned the lesson that violence breeds counter-violence, and it cannot be condoned, whatever the source.
It didn't work. Humphrey's November defeat ushered in the era of Republican presidential dominance, with 7 GOP victories in the last 10 elections.
All right, so what I find kind of interesting about this short clip, I mean, it's not much anything, but it could be, like a primary source showing what was actually going on in the Democratic National Convention. But they're trying to, basically elect the person they're going to put up to be the next president of the United States, fighting for all these, causes of equality, if you will. And here they are, right outside their own door, having protests about the very thing that they hope to fix. And it's kind of, why are we doing this? We should probably come up with another solution. And I find that clip interesting just because it shows maybe the disconnect between the inside and the outside of that building. So, the Republican nominee's campaign was defined by shrewd maintenance of his public appearances and a pledge to restore peace and prosperity to what he called the silent center. And again, this is Richard Nixon. The millions of people in the middle of the political spectrum. This was his campaign for the silent majority, is what he called it. The people right in the middle, the ones who don't speak out too much on either side of the issues, they're in the middle. Nixon's message was many embraced Nixon's message, let me say that. A September 1968 poll found that 80% of Americans had believed that law and order had broken down. Once Nixon was elected and installed in the White House, he focused his energies on American foreign policy, publicly announcing the Nixon Doctrine of 1969. Nixon asserted the supremacy of American democratic capitalism, and he conceded that the United States would continue supporting its allies financially. However, he denounced previous administrations' willingness to commit American forces to third world conflicts and warned other states to assume responsibility for their own defense. He was turning America away from the policy of active anti-communist containment and toward a new strategy of detente. Any of my students know I'm not good at reading these words with the little accents and stuff over them, so sorry if I said it wrong. So, promoted by national security, promoted by a national security advisor and eventual Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, detente sought to stabilize the international system by thawing the relations with Cold War rivals and bilaterally freezing arms levels. Taking advantage of tensions between Communist China and the Soviet Union, Nixon pursued closer relations with both in order to de-escalate tensions and strengthen the United States' position relative to each. The strategy seemed to work. Nixon became the first American president to visit Communist China, and he did that in 1971, and first since Franklin Roosevelt to visit the Soviet Union, 1972 he did that. And he didn't play ping pong in China like Forrest Gump did, but hey, Nixon can't do everything. So, Both countries grew and culminated with the formal normalization of U.S. to China relations. The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, ABM, and the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty, SALT I, the first one, by 1973, these were Soviet arms agreements. And for once, maybe peaceful coexistence kind of seemed possible. So, let's see what's next. Oh, here comes my son again. So, we have an energy crisis. Hey, buddy, what you doing? Okay, you need to be quiet, okay? You can probably see him running by over there. Side note, he has put on clothes throughout this whole pandemic. Sometimes it's by like 1 or 2 o'clock, but for me, you know, just getting him out of bed, fed, and showered is an accomplishment. So yeah. So, the 1973 energy crisis. OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, placed an embargo on oil sent to the U.S. for intervening in the Middle East. The oil crisis showed that small countries could still hurt the United States. At a time of anxiety about the nation's future, Vietnam and the energy crisis accelerated Americans' disenchantment with the United States' role in the world and the efficacy and quality of its leaders. But that wasn't as bad as it got. No scandal did more for, I guess you could say, unraveling public trust, unraveling Americans' trust in the government, than the Watergate scandal. And again, I keep referencing Forrest Gump because honestly the way I heard about a lot of this stuff and kind of connected all the dots was by watching Forrest Gump. So if you're allowed to watch it, check it out because you'll see almost every single one of these things shows up in that movie some way or another. And maybe if we ever get back to school, we can show that movie. But in June 17th, 1972, 5 men were arrested inside the offices of the Democratic National Committee, the DNC, in the Watergate complex in downtown Washington, D.C., after being tipped off by a security guard that police found the men attempting to install sophisticated bugging equipment. Greg, you need to go do that over there, okay? Go over by the foosball table. One of those arrested was a former CIA employee that was working as a security aide for Nixon's administration, committee to re-elect the president. Lampooned as creep. So it was basically a guy that was working for Nixon to help him get re-elected. Hopefully you can see why this is a problem. They're trying to bug the Democratic Party, basically the opposition to Nixon, and it's Nixon's own guys doing it to help him get re-elected. So they're trying to gather information illegally that is going to essentially help the president get reelected. It's almost like some House of Cards stuff, or again, like I said, Forrest Gump. Or maybe even President Trump in Russia. Who knows? While there is no direct evidence that Nixon ordered the Watergate break-in, he had been recorded in conversation with his chief of staff requesting that the DNC chairman be illegally wiretapped to obtain the names of the committee's financial supporters. The names could then be given to the Justice Department and the IRS to conduct investigations into their personal affairs. Nixon basically told them to kind of break into the offices of the Brookings Institution and take files relating to the war in Vietnam. And he says, this is his quote, "God damn it, get in and get those files, blow the safe and get it." Well, I guess Nixon went a little too far. So, next slide.
Look at me. Look at me.
Cool, dude. Come here. Let me show everybody what you're up to. Come here. He's discovered the Xbox. So, why don't you go over there and play with your headset on? Go on.
Yeah, but
I have almost done. Okay, buddy, go on. And he's got his underwear inside out. Yeah. Can we please do the social isolation so we can all get back to our normal and I can go teach and then the daycare people can wipe his butt and all that stuff. But we have gotten closer. So there's positives to it, I guess. All right, slide 10 of 12 right here. So, general prosperity of this period, or of the period prior, masked deeper vulnerabilities. Perhaps no case better illustrates it than the decline of American industry and the creation of an intractable urban crisis than Detroit. Detroit is sort of the poster child of the urban crisis. The auto industry and World War II, Detroit boomed during this time. Ford and General Motors converted their assembly lines to build machines for the American war effort, and observers dubbed the city the arsenal of democracy. After the war, however, automobile firms began closing urban factories and moving to outlying suburbs. Several factors fueled the process. Some cities kind of deindustrialized themselves, and they basically tried to make room for like high-rise apartments and stuff, and office buildings. So they sort of put their factories and stuff out of the city and wanted people to live there and have, you know, corporate type of headquarters and whatnot there. A manager at a newly automated Ford engine plant in post-war Cleveland captured the interconnections between these concerns when he noted to United Automobile Workers, UAW, President Walter Reuther, "You are going to have trouble collecting union dues from all of these machines." So essentially, you're replacing these people with machines who don't get paid and who don't join the union and who don't care about labor rights because, well, they are machines. Maybe in another 1,000 years we'll care about labor rights for machines. But we're sort of pulling people from the workforce and replacing them with machines who don't pay taxes and who don't pay union dues and who don't fight for rights and all that stuff. Sure, the company pays taxes, but maybe it's not equal as it could be with people paying taxes and union dues. Maybe an argument for a different day. Detroit began to bleed industrial jobs. Literally, they leave and leave and leave. Buddy, what? Son, I'm doing something right now. You need to go hang out over there. I'm almost done, okay? Here you go, buddy. Going over there. Chrysler, which actually kept more jobs in Detroit than Ford or General Motors, cut its Detroit production workforce in half. Okay, and the years between 1953 and 1960, East Detroit lost 10 plants and over 71,000 jobs. And Detroit was a single industry city, automobiles, right? And made the big three automakers, when they shut these doors and reduced their factory production and such, it had sort of a ripple effect, right? Think of all the other factories that produce parts for these auto manufacturers. Like, in my mind, I think of the Autolite spark plugs, right? I think they were maybe in Toledo or South Detroit. I don't know exactly where they were. But they also were not as needed because the automakers were failing to produce as many cars. And so it kind of reverberates out through the rest of the country, and, you know, really the Rust Belt as it's known. Like Ohio, Pennsylvania, parts of Indiana, all the way to Illinois, so and so. So the number of manufacturing firms in Detroit went from over 3,000 to fewer than 2,000. The labor force was gutted. Manufacturing jobs fell from 338,400 to 153,000 over the same 3 decades. That's pretty crazy. So, just in that short time period, that big of a drop. Wild. And so this industrial restructuring decimated all workers, but deindustrialization fell heaviest on the city's African Americans. Many middle-class blacks, Detroiters managed to move out of the city's ghettos by 1960. 19.7% of black auto workers in Detroit were unemployed. So almost 20% of black auto workers in Detroit were unemployed, compared to just 5.8% of whites. So the North was supposed to be this desegregated, utopia, but it proves that segregation can exist in other ways, and discrimination can exist in other ways than overtly physical violence. Overt discrimination in housing and unemployment had for decades confined African Americans to segregated neighborhoods where they were forced to pay exorbitant rents for slum housing. They're subject to residential intimidation and cut off from traditional sources of credit. Few of them could afford to follow industry as they left the city for the suburbs and other parts of the country. Over time, Detroit devolved into a mass of unemployment, crime, and crippled municipal resources. When riots rocked Detroit in '67, 25 to 30% of black residents between the ages of 18 and 24 were unemployed. So this leads to the Sun Belt. Geography dictated much of labor's fall. As American firms fled pro-labor states in the 70s and 80s, some went overseas in wake of new trade treaties to exploit low-wage foreign workers, but others turned to anti-union states in the South. And what I think is important to talk about with this is the anti-union states in the South had a better climate for the business. They didn't have to so much, they weren't bound by the union business owner laws that often influence the decisions up in the North. The states that these businesses moved to down in the South were actually anti-union for the most part, and so it allowed the manufacturers to kind of get away with more labor law violations, or maybe not labor law violations, but kind of allowed them to exploit the worker a little more. And there's other things that go into the reason why the rise of the Sun Belt occurs. But we have air conditioning, non-union labor, subsidies, investments, and military spending. Those three things sort of allow it to the industry to move down to the South. This term, the Sun Belt, was coined by journalist Kevin Phillips in 1969. And it refers to the swath of southern and western states that saw unprecedented economic, industrial, and demographic growth after World War II. So during the New Deal, President Roosevelt had declared the South the nation's #1 economic problem and injected massive federal subsidies down into the South. During the Cold War, Sun Belt politicians lobbied hard for military installations and government contracts for their states. So we were getting like a bunch of NASA research and stuff goes on down there. The southern states' hostility towards organized labor beckoned corporate leaders. The Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 facilitated southern states' frontal assault on unions. Cheap, non-unionized labor, low wages, and lax regulations pulled northern industries away from the Rust Belt. Skilled northern workers, so the workers in the north that were skilled, followed the new jobs south and west. They were lured by cheap housing and a warm climate that was slowly made more tolerable by modern air conditioning. And if you have lived in the South, or if you live in the South, you know how rough some of those August and September afternoons can get after a rain shower when it's humid and 100 degrees. Air conditioning made that a little more tolerable. And lastly, let's talk about the politics of love, sex, and gender. The sexual revolution continued into the 70s. Many Americans, specifically feminists, gay men, lesbians, and straight couples, they kind of challenged strict gender roles and rejected the rigidity of the nuclear family. People lived together without being married. This increased drastically during this time period. Straight couples married later. They just waited to marry, if they married at all. Divorce levels climbed. Sexuality, which was decoupled from marriage and procreation, became for many not only a source of personal fulfillment, but a worthy political cause. Now, at the turn of the century, so like the 1900s, sexuality was a private matter, but it was kind of regulated by the states. And it typically defined legitimate sexual expression within the confines of patriarchal, procreative marriage. So basically the husband and wife, or the husband and procreative marriage. Interracial marriage, for instance, was illegal in many states until 1967, and it remained largely taboo until afterwards. Same-sex intercourse and cross-dressing were criminalized in most states. And gay men, lesbians, and transgender people were vulnerable to violent police enforcement as well as discrimination in housing and employment. So, if you think of 2019-20 time, where there's now a TV show or TV shows for people going through gender changes and all those other terms, bisexual or gay, lesbian, LGBTQ, all of it. This is in stark contrast to roughly 60 years ago. Roe versus Wade. This was a Supreme Court case that struck down a Texas law that prohibited abortion in all cases when a mother's life was not in danger. The court's decision was built on precedent from a 1965 ruling that, in striking down a Connecticut law prohibiting married couples from using birth control, recognized a constitutional right to privacy. In Roe, the court reasoned that this right of privacy is broad enough to encompass a woman's decision whether or not to terminate her pregnancy. The court held that states could not interfere with a woman's right to an abortion during the first trimester of pregnancy, and could only fully prohibit abortions during the third trimester. So, the first trimester, any woman could choose to have an abortion. No state can interfere. Second trimester, there's certain rules, and the third trimester is the only time the state can fully prohibit it. It's kind of odd talking about this with my little baby down here that's 4 months old, and when you see those ultrasounds, third trimester baby looks pretty human. So I don't want to get political about my beliefs or not, but something to think about the laws and the legality and decisions and whose rights to choose and right to life, and whichever side you are on, there's great arguments for both sides. And so it's just something to think about in your mind about the rights of the many and the few, and who's vulnerable and who's not, and so on and so forth. All right, get off my pedestal sort of for now. Miller v. California was a freedom of speech case, or First Amendment case, and basically the people wanted to rule that pornographic material was a form of expression and it should be protected under the First Amendment, and it basically said the First Amendment did not protect pornographic material. So, the meantime, gay men and women negotiated a harsh world that stigmatized homosexuality as a mental illness or an immoral depravity. They were building on post-war efforts by gay rights organizations to bring homosexuality into the mainstream of American culture. Young gay activists of the late 60s and 70s began to challenge what they saw as the conservative gradualism of the homophile movement. They were inspired by the Black Power movement and New Left protests of the Vietnam War, the counterculture movement of sexual freedom. Gay and lesbian activists agitated for a broader set of sexual rights that emphasized an assertive notion of liberation rooted not in mainstream assimilation, but in pride of sexual difference. So they wanted to, I guess, they wanted broader sexual rights, and they wanted liberation, not to be accepted into the, I guess, the public, if you will, but they wanted to be proud of who they were and maybe stand out as their own subgroup. Now, this is the picture here too. One incident galvanized gay and lesbian activism, and that was in 1969 at the Stonewall Inn. Bar patrons protested and sparked a multi-day street battle that catalyzed a national movement for gay liberation. Seemingly overnight, calls for homophile respectability were replaced with chants of gay power. And again, that's very comparable to Black Power movement. In the following years, gay Americans gained unparalleled access to private and public spaces. Gay activists increasingly attacked cultural norms that expected them to keep their homosexuality hidden. And they said that keeping these secrets contributed to stigma and suicide. And so they said, hey guys, come out and be proud of who you are. In 1973, the American Psychiatric Association stopped classifying homosexuality as a mental illness, and pressure mounted on politicians. So in 1982, Wisconsin became the first state to ban discrimination based on sexual orientation. Now, the Equal Rights Amendment is an interesting amendment because it had supporters from a wide range of different groups, but at the same time, some of the groups you would have expected to support the Equal Rights Amendment didn't for fear of what that would mean. So, the amendment declared, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. These sorts of laws were introduced every year in Congress since 1923, essentially since women gained the right to vote. The ERA was sent to the states to ratify in 1972, and I think it was on that exact day Hawaii even ratified it. And it looked like they were going to do it right away. 30 states had done it. It took years for more states to pass it, and in 1977, Indiana became the 35th and final state to ratify it. But that wasn't quite enough. So as fast as it started to go around, it slowed down. Anti-ERA forces had successfully turned the political tide against the amendment. At a time when many women shared Betty Friedan's frustration that society seemed to confine women to the role of homemaker. She was the problem without a name, the one who said women and housewives were not happy across the nation, and they found that they all kind of shared that feeling. Not they all, a lot of them shared that feeling. Phyllis Schlafly's Stop ERA organization, which was Stop Taking Our Privileges, trumpeted the value and advantages of being a homemaker and mother. So essentially, this woman is fighting the amendment because she likes the ability and the advantages and the value of being a homemaker. So not all women felt the same way as Betty Friedan. They were able to marshal the support of the evangelical Christians and other religious conservatives. Schlafly worked tirelessly to stifle the ERA. She lobbied legislators. She organized counter-rallies to ensure that Americans heard from the millions of happily married women who believe in the laws which protect the family and require the husband to support his wife and children. So the amendment only needed 3 more states. So after Indiana, 35, it only needed 3 more states for ratification. It never got them. So it came so close, but they never got those extra 3 states. In 1982, the time limit for the amendment had expired, and along with it, the amendment expired too. And so the Equal Rights Amendment kind of meets its death. And so, I guess to wrap things up and give you some thoughts on the Equal Rights Amendment, it's interesting. Often what you see when we're talking about opposition or beliefs on political things are the extremes, the far left or the far right, or the people who are most boisterous, And I think maybe Nixon was onto something with the silent majority, if you will, the people in the middle who aren't riled up too much or too extreme on either side. And perhaps when we say Schlafly comes out, she's a part of that silent majority, or was a part of that silent majority. Or maybe she's even on the extreme conservative side, I guess you could say. So maybe she isn't the silent majority. But either way, she's saying that a lot of people are content with this husband-wife relationship and the homemaker relationship and whatnot. And so maybe we shouldn't go so far as to possibly eliminate all those advantages right off the bat. And so regardless of what you think, I would hope that everyone should hope for equality and justice and fairness and equal access to opportunities and all those things. But remember, there are some people who do like the status quo, like how things are. And so, got my daughter to sleep, my son's in there, hopefully not destroying whatever we have in there, and I'm sure he's still breathing because I can hear him kick a soccer ball every once in a while. But for now, that's all we got. Remember to check those key terms, make sure you can define them all, read along in the chapters, and my students, we got a quiz coming up soon, so be sure to study and know all your key terms. So until next time, it's Mr. Kretz's Social Studies class, the College Credit Plus, during the coronavirus pandemic, recording live from my basement. I've been in quarantine for too long. See you guys.